Welcome to Patreon Tier 3, Garden of Arcane Delights. My guest this month is Dr. Jonathon O'Donnell. Jonathon is a visiting scholar in the School of Natural and Built Environment at Queen's University, Belfast. They are the author of Passing Orders, Demonology and Sovereignty in American Spiritual Warfare from Fordham University Press, 2021. Their research focuses on the intersections of socio-political demonization and religious demonologies in contemporary America, with specific attention paid to Islamophobia, anti-Blackness, queerphobic, and transphobic ideologies. Their latest publication in the Journal of American Academy of Religion explores the relationship between contemporary evangelical demonologies of the Nephilim and their connection to wider Christian nationalist, anti-Black, and anti-Palestinian politics. Links to their research and contact details can be found at their website, www.drsjodonnell.com. You can find the link to Jonathon's website in the program notes. In this interview, Jonathon discusses 4 articles, and again, all links can be found in the program notes, that span a range of topics, and this is a long one, nearly 3 hours, so I'm just going to shut up and let's just jump right in. I hope you enjoy. Welcome to Rejected Religion Patreon Tier 3, Garden of Arcane Delights. My guest this month is Jonathon O'Donnell. Welcome, Jonathon.
Pleasure to be here, Stephanie.
It's good to see you again, and it's good to have you back. You were a guest on the podcast, and that was
2 or 3 years ago.
And you also did a little roundtable discussion about midnight mass, which was loads of fun. Remember that?
That was a lot of fun.
So much has happened in the meantime.
That slipped my mind. I'd forgotten that I'd done that.
But it's good to have you back. You have been very busy in the past several years, writing a lot of articles, and you kindly agreed to come talk about your research and give us some updates about what you're doing. And I'm really looking forward into getting into all of the nitty-gritty of all of this. I really love your research topic to begin with. So, you already know that. But for the listeners out there, we're going to be talking about demonology. And this is a fascinating area to really delve into. So since we last spoke about your research and what you're doing, what new elements or topics have you been focusing on, and how is your research developing? Let's start there.
So I think last time we spoke was shortly after the publication of my book, which looked at the development and core concepts of spiritual warfare, which is the concept of battling demons through a combination of prayer and activism and various methods that's common in contemporary Christianity broadly. I particularly focused on it in evangelical Protestantism, but it's worth noting that it also exists in Catholicism and kind of forms of Eastern Orthodoxy as well, and that those groups are, at least today, like generally fairly networked, which I think is and that kind of touches on one element of kind of what I've started to look at since my book, which was the way that demonology can operate almost as a kind of interdenominational political glue that ties together like disparate forms of primarily Christianity, but also occasionally Judaism in the West, in order to create like generally kind of reactionary political coalitions that coalesce around demonology as like a conceptual framework. So that's kind of one element that I've been looking at. A good example of this, which I'm sure we might talk about later, is to do with the January 6th insurrection in the States, where about a month before, on like December 12th, I think it was, there was a Jericho march on Washington that was
Right.
organized by uh, Stop the Steal, which was the kind of conspiracy organization that believed that Biden had stolen the election.
Mm-hmm.
It was a kind of interdenominational event that had like evangelicals, Catholics, and kind of Eastern Orthodox speakers, and they all kind of got together and had a rally, and they marched around Washington and tried to exorcise the demons they saw as like inhabiting like the Capitol building and the judiciary and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the people who went to that rally then also turned up on January the 6th to like storm the Capitol. But
Right.
it was an interesting about a month apart, but it was an interesting like first step of kind of almost like spiritual delegitimization of
Mm.
the Capitol, where they're kind of like priming the ground for this kind of explosion of like transformation and change, which they then politically
Yeah.
enacted like a month later.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's been one element. I'm kind of, I guess, continuing the through lines of my book research and kind of seeing where those threads continue to lead. Other aspects that I've been focusing on that's kind of grown out of that and also grown out of some elements that I couldn't put in my book, but were still elements of my kind of that research project that I had to put down are things to do with the environment and particularly climate change skepticism and like hostility to notions of anthropogenic climate change and the way that that intersects with demonology and kind of strategies of political demonization in America, aspects of technology and like ideas of emerging technology and how technology becomes infused with kind of demonic influence or sometimes divine potential as well, depending on the form of technology. You look
Mm-hmm.
at like, I mean, the way that the internet is used by a lot of these groups to kind of
Right.
further
Okay.
specific political and religious agendas, like in QAnon and things like that,
Mm-hmm.
for
Mm-hmm.
example. You see this kind of like the way that technology interfaces with these groups on a kind of national and international level. So that's kind of like environment, technology, transnationalism, kind of those kind of, and the way that those concepts kind of come together in the modern spiritual warfare movement. But also the way that the spiritual warfare movement itself like intersects with wider kind of reactionary ideologies, movements, political groups, things like that. So I want to kind of broaden out slightly and see the way that these ideas feed into and feed on a kind of wider reactionary political milieu in the modern world.
Right. Well, the articles that you sent to me reflect that, and I'm glad that we will be able to discuss your work. The first article that I'd like to get into is called Modern Demonology: The Discernment of Spirits in the Theater of Colonial Modernity. And this is from the Journal of Contemporary Religion.
I
And
had so
this is
much fun writing that one.
yeah, I mean, all of these articles were so interesting to read. I'm serious. I'm not just, buttering you up here. You know, this is really good stuff that you're writing. Very
On that
interesting.
note, the one in the Journal of the American Academy of Religion, which we'll touch on later
Yeah.
on, like the Nephilim, came out yesterday properly.
Did it?
So
Oh, well,
yeah, so
congratulations.
it is now out in the world.
Oh, I feel so privileged to have already read it. So,
Yeah.
oh, thank you
For
for that.
I guess for the listeners, because I'm not sure when this is going to be made available.
This will
Like
be in
yesterday would
October.
have been September the 10th in this
Okay.
context.
So,
Uh,
this will be uploaded in October. So,
yeah, yeah.
September.
So a month ago, at the time of
Yes.
listening, the
Okay.
article will be out.
Good.
Possibly the other article in Nova Religio, which we'll also touch on later, will also be out by then.
Is that the one about the
Yeah,
Judeo-Christianity?
that's Judeo. That's
Okay.
the one on Judeo-Christianity.
Okay. Nova.
I've looked at the proofs for that already and like sent them off and everything, and that's all been sorted. So hopefully
Great.
that will be out. So that will be out by the time this episode goes live as
Good.
well.
Good. Well, I'm very happy to hear that.
Mm,
All right. So getting back to the first article about modern
mm,
demonology, that this one you published last year,
mm.
2023.
Yeah.
If you could first give a short description of what you mean by modern demonology, because you're using this term specifically. And then I've got all these other questions for you. So start there.
Okay. So, like, I guess, like, this touches on kind of the reason that I wrote the article to begin with. Which partly was the way that whenever I talk to people about studying demonology, there's an assumption that if I'm studying demonology, I'm studying older stuff. Maybe like the witch hunts, like things like that, kind of classic early modern demonology, essentially. And we'll maybe touch on the early modern aspect of that actually later, although I don't touch on it too much in the article, but it's kind of relevant here. And in general, like when they realize that they don't look at like kind of witch hunt era early modern demonology, there's a kind of general assumption that the demonology that is around today is a kind of archaic throwback of some description. It's something pre-modern. It's like a kind of unenlightened aspect of like pre-modern religiosity that's kind of hung around and hasn't been exorcised, I guess, from like rational faith at this point.
Pun intended.
Which is a kind of common idea that you see with a lot of kind of the more, I guess you might call them like the outre aspects of contemporary religiosity, whether that's kind of demonology or mysticism or various others. There's this kind of assumption that they're like older or less rational or things like that. So that was kind of one of the impetus for writing this article. So one of the things, the main thing that I wanted to kind of identify and look at was the way that contemporary demonology in spiritual warfare is distinctly modern, in the sense that like it is itself a product of modernity, with modernity's specific fixations on like classification, on like rational inquiry, on like the sort of rational classificatory mindset that attempts to kind of sort the world into distinct, like easily manageable and separate categories and break it down for identification. And like very focused on like the concept of reason and the concept of rationality. But also related to that, the relationship between modernity and colonialism, which is a very prominent aspect of the development of historical modernity, like as a kind of political and social force, and has been a kind of core topic that has been examined by kind of post-colonial theorists and sociologists and anthropologists in the last kind of few decades. The processes and the kind of development of European modernity relied on a kind of resource extraction, which was both like literal, like physical resources, like labor, gems, coal, like fuel, things like that, raw materials that were then like converted into goods in factories and things like that. But also a kind of like what we might refer to as kind of an epistemic capital, like the kind of anthropological inquiry into others with the capital O, like out there on the global periphery that could be brought back and synthesized and understood, like in the imperial core, like during the development of modernity. This is what's often referred to in scholarship as colonial modernity, which is in the title of the article. So the article kind of was focused on that and was focused on the way that demonology in its kind of modern, contemporary kind of spiritual warfare framework is itself a product of colonial modernity. It's not something that's kind of pre-modern or like archaic in a specific way. And in fact, it like often has very little in common with the kind of more classical demonologies that people may be aware of. Often it's not even aware of those older demonologies. Like you won't really get contemporary spiritual warriors like referencing like the Lexici of Solomon, for example, or the Pseudomonarchia Demonorum, or like texts like that, for example, there. Or even the kind of more or even kind of classical theological treatises, like some of the Catholic ones on like Aquinas, for example, that touch on the nature of demons and things like that.
Right.
Like it's often conducted entirely in a bubble that's like distinct from Christianity's like theological, like sort of antique and medieval like demonological theorization. So it's recent. But also that it kind of mirrors a lot of the concerns of colonial modernity specifically, and a lot of the power structures of colonial modernity, in that it relies on this kind of relationship between the periphery and the center, in the sense that it relies on primarily Western, either trained or like Western trained or Western like grounded, based, sorry, I guess would be the word, missionary networks and things that then go out to countries on the imperial periphery. Essentially, they go to the Middle East, to South America, to East Asia, like sometimes even to Africa, to Europe, even because we're talking about America specifically here. And then they go there and they essentially identify and start like seeing demons in those regions, and then they bring the knowledge of those demons back to the imperial heartland, to America itself, where they then write books and theorize about like the nature of demonic presences in these kind of extra American territories, and like and how it might be good to combat these and to thereby like evangelize the population more broadly. So I guess that's like a general overview.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I mean, this is good, just setting it up for all the questions that I'm going to be asking you. So the first question that I have is regarding the term discernment, and I have heard this term in my youth because I grew up in an evangelical environment. I found this interesting because you talk about how this is a modern concept and not one from the early modern period. So this kind of comes back to what you just mentioned before. I liked the way that you wrote about this, so I'd like you to talk about this. What do you mean, or what is meant? Not do you mean, but what is meant in the circles of the charismatic evangelicals by this term? What is this? What is this talking about?
I'm actually going to pull up my article very quickly because I'm like, how did I describe it? Yeah, so I guess like discernment is like, I guess like what I'd refer to as like a strategy within contemporary like evangelicalism. But I mean, it's probably used beyond evangelicalism, but like evangelicalism is the context in which I'm writing about it, and it's the context in which I'm kind of aware of it. So I'm basically just saying that to not make generalizations. So
Understood.
don't come for me if listeners, don't come for me if you're Catholic and you have a very different understanding of discernment. Discernment is to kind of use one of the spiritual warriors that I kind of write about. Discernment is often used as a shortening of the concept of what is called the discerning of spirits. The discerning of spirits is ultimately a kind of way to identify what spiritual entities are at work in a specific context, primarily whether these spiritual entities are angelic or divine or demonic. It's very like hinged on ideas of kind of distinguishing or like judicially or mentally deciding things or trying or judging. It's a concept that's very closely related to like judgment, and is described by some writers as the way in which practitioners, quote, rightly divide the complexity of the events around us and choose the best way to advance, which I always liked as the kind of as a quote for how to deal with discernment. So discernment is within charismatic and Pentecostal thought, like currently, the methodology by which believers or practitioners of spiritual warfare use like their mind, their rationality, and like their senses to kind of figure out what is going on in a specific context, but specifically in like a kind of spiritual sense, in the sense that they are discerning demonic influence in like an event or a person or a location or just like a context more generally. And like I think that the relationship of the senses is kind of important here in the sense that like discernment is fundamentally like a faculty that relies on the gathering and interpretation of data that is gathered like through the five senses and through kind of a form of kind of rational inquiry through which that kind of sense data is organized and cataloged and correlated and like how they sift the evidence, how they detect patterns, like how they and then ultimately what they decide to do, like how do they judge the correct course of action in this context. And there's kind of like a core tension in a lot of the way that discernment is discussed, in that it's often like very rooted in, like they often talk about like how like they're constantly like going back to the Bible or going back to various other kind of sources of divine like inspiration in order to kind of basically to test their sense data against like the capital T truth in this context. So there's this constant kind of back and forth between like this kind of gathering of almost like empiricist data about the world and like the establishing of pre-existing categories in terms of like how that data is then organized and associated. And like one of the things I talk about in the article quite a bit is the way that a lot of the sense data is I mean, to put it bluntly, kind of biased.
Yes.
In the way that like they will go to locations. Like there's one example I use, I think, where a female spiritual warrior who is doing a lot of international travel, and she's trying to discern like what demons are prominent in specific regions. And I think she goes to China and she talks about like the spirits of lust and perversity that are like rampant there, which is just kind of often just tying back to these kind of stereotypes of kind of
Yes.
East Asian men specifically as like and things like and then like similarly like in the Middle East they'll talk about like oh the spirits of violence that like you
Mm-hmm.
know were impinging on my thoughts, and it's like no, you've just internalized a lot of propaganda about how like Muslims are violent. So
Right.
like you go
Right.
to these places and you're like, oh, I sense an air of violence about me.
Yeah, it's quite interesting how you described it as being this rational testing
Mm,
type of, consideration, and it's almost like it's an empirical,
mm,
endeavor to figure out what's going on here. But in practice, though, I mean, you just gave the example of one of the way, how
yeah.
people are talking about this. It does come across as being very subjective, and also that people have their biases. They've got their preconceived
Yeah.
notions about things, and then they, oh, hey
Mm,
presto, that's my discernment talking. It's telling me that that this kind of demon is here,
yeah.
or whatever is going on. I have my own experiences from my
Mm,
youth in hearing people in the church talk in that same fashion, that oh, I've got this all figured out. And I wondered, and maybe I'm going to answer my question while I'm asking the question, but I was wondering how they got away with talking about this in terms of this being acceptable, because if you just in any other case, if you would walk into a situation, you say, "Well, I sense this, or I'm feeling this, or the way this looks, it looks off to me." This would be called, in quote unquote occult circles, that would be called clairsentience. That you
mm,
have this knowing about something and you can't really explain why.
mm.
And I think I'm answering my own question as I talk out loud, but the way you explained it is that they're testing this against Bible verses or other types of doctrines
Yeah.
that they've been
Often strategically selected
yeah,
Bible
right.
verses.
So they would not categorize this as some kind of psychic
Yeah.
gift.
But like I think you touch on a really interesting element there, which is a tension within contemporary kind of Pentecostal charismatic Christianity in general, I think, which is and I talk about this in my book quite a bit, particularly in the chapter on Jezebel, which is the concept of witchcraft.
Right.
And like witchcraft is essentially like there is functionally, from an outsider perspective, no difference between what they call witchcraft and what they're actually doing. Like in terms of the actual function of like the things that are happening. It's like from an internal discourse element, they constantly need to kind of police these boundaries around like what is acceptable practice. And like people talk about kind of lapsing into witchcraft, for example, when they're with their kind of basically when like God is kind of feeding them information like via prayer and kind of psychic connections and things like that. And they constantly need to like police themselves and their views in line with what they believe scripture to say in order to prevent themselves from essentially like becoming witches, like functionally.
Right.
But like it means there's this constant boundary policing around these acts and around like the kind of ends to which these acts are put. Because often there is like functionally no actual difference between discernment and clairsentience, like in your to use your analogy there.
Yeah.
It's just like it's a division they have drawn where they've gone, this is legitimate and this is illegitimate
Yeah.
forms of knowledge. And like power plays a huge part in this. It's very common. I don't think I talk about it specifically in this article, but you know, there's examples I've used in my book and elsewhere where, for example, you'll have like a pastor in a church who has a particular viewpoint, and then someone in the congregation will get up and be like, basically start calling them out on something they've said or something they've done, and they won't ever say what these people have said, but they'll talk, for example, extensively about how like, oh, a spirit of Jezebel like inhabited them and caused them to do this, and it's like, and then they're like exiled from the church and things like that, and it's kind of like, and it's like, I don't know what this person said because you haven't replicated it like within your work, but like it's very easy to see how like one person's discernment may be another person's like demonic spirit that conveniently you need to get out of your church.
Well, yeah. I mean, there is something to be said for that about the political side of all of this within
Yeah.
the church and the congregation. If you have problematic people, you know,
Yeah,
these are labels that you can use very easily.
yeah.
You
Like
know,
I think it's important with something like discernment and the way that I talk about it as well, like specifically, because like there are probably a lot of books by spiritual warriors and Pentecostals and charismatics like in like South America, Africa, East Asia, example, who use these concepts to talk about like their own culture and their own context. In fact, like I wrote a paper a number of years ago about like a Japanese spiritual warrior, kind of drawing on some of the research I did when I lived in Japan a number of years ago. And like he has like interestingly, like because he's connected to a lot of the spiritual warriors that I write about, and like he uses all of their frameworks. But because he is a native Japanese person who's grown up in Japan, he has a much more nuanced and interesting understanding of like the way that his concept of like the demonic like actually maps onto traditional Japanese religion and history and things like that. Whereas a lot of the Americans writing about it will make these kind of broad generalizations that like have very little like actual application to like on the ground Japanese history and Japanese politics. It's like they read like, you know, a short summary of like a couple of events historically and we're like, oh, clearly this is where the demons are from.
right.
But I think it's important when you're talking about the way that discernment is used in American spiritual warfare text specifically, which is what the article focuses on, in the way that they use these other countries as data gathering sites, essentially. They're kind of going out and they're kind of doing a kind of form of like classical anthropological scholarship in a sense, like not like modern anthropology, which is kind of wrestled with its history, but more like the anthropology that was done in the colonial overt colonial period where like missionaries would go out to India and to Africa and to Central and South America and make various judgments about the societies they find there and like interpret those societies like entirely through the lens
Yeah.
of their own culture, which
Yeah.
also sort of ties into the way that this is very much this feels like a kind of colonial modern pattern or like a
Yeah.
neo-colonial modern pattern in a lot of ways because it
Right.
like
Right.
relies on that kind of the kind of neo-colonial American imperial model of like global trade networks and like that kind of
Hmm.
leveraging of resources and access, rather than the kind of the classical European empires of yesteryear, which have more direct territorial control.
Yeah, that's an interesting aspect of this that when you're in it, when you're in that
Mm,
environment and this is what you believe in, you're not thinking in this way. You're not thinking that, oh yeah, I'm doing this in a with through the lens of this Western colonialist perspective. You're not thinking
mm,
like that. It's only, when you get to
yeah,
step outside of it and then you're looking at it, that you're like, oh yeah, that's actually quite
yeah,
problematic. What's going on here?
yeah,
So they think they're doing a good thing,
yeah.
but yeah, yeah.
I will say, and I haven't done tons of research because this isn't my area, and I haven't done tons of research, but it's very interesting because these are Americans, the way they interact with specifically like Native American cosmologies, like in the continental United States, because like there are quite a lot of Native American evangelicals in general. I don't know if there's like tons, but like there's been scholarship written on Native American evangelicals, for example, and like the interactions there. And there's often like when they do address it, there's often slightly more sensitivity, like
Mm,
in a lot of ways, like slightly less like overt, like calling Native American spiritual beings and things like demonic directly, like
yeah.
they do for cultures that are not like in from the continental United States. And I'm using continental United States specifically because I've seen tons of stuff in Hawaii, like about Hawaii, for example,
Hmm.
that's very just like more like the rest of the stuff, where they're just like, oh yeah, all these Hawaiian gods are demonic entities and things like that.
Oh.
But I haven't seen that so much for like Native Americans, like within the continental United States, where there's
Okay.
either a kind of careful omission and they don't really talk about it,
Hmm.
or there's slight more sensitivity to it. Like they'll try and be slightly more aware about like cultural customs and things like that and like taboos and like that kind of context. Which is I think is like it's not an area that I personally have looked at extensively. It's an area that like other scholars have looked at though.
Hmm.
But yeah, it's like it's an interesting division, which I think also speaks to the way that these kind of missionary networks are treating like foreign mission sites essentially as
Mm.
kind of sites of data extraction.
That is interesting. And I'm glad that you pointed that out because yeah, it is kind of easy to forget that there are evangelicals of all
Yeah,
creeds, nations, however you want to call that, more diverse types of groups. You do have evangelicals in all of these areas. So, yeah, important point to make. And it's also a very interesting one that it's not all the same.
yeah.
So, getting back to the demonologies,
Hmm.
how are these modern demonologies framed by Pentecostal and charismatic Christians?
In what way?
Well, you talk in the article about the spiritual warfare, how it's
Hmm.
playing out in the United States, especially within the politics,
Hmm.
and how does this play out? The You
Hmm.
have a framework of what the demonology is about, and you're
Hmm.
plugging that into, in this example, the U.S. politics.
Yeah.
How does that play out?
So I guess there's like a few things, and I guess I can touch slightly on like the way I open the article, which is with one of my favorite. Like this is kind of what germinated this article actually is the kind of quote that I open it with,
Okay.
which is a quote from the foreword to John Paul Jackson's spiritual warfare book, Needless Casualties of War, which is it's by an author called John A. Sandford, who I've never been able to track down other than this article. I think he exists. There's several authors who have very similar names to him, so I've never been entirely sure if it's a typo or not.
Okay.
Like there's a John A. Sanford, and there's like a something Sandford as well, but there's never been a John A. Sandford so that I can
Oh,
identify.
okay.
But anyway, that's another question. But the quote was, historically, when we in the charismatic movement discovered demons were real, we rushed into the fray inexperienced and in many ways ignorant and naive. And this quote fascinated me for literally years from when I encountered it. And it was specifically like the opening of that. Like it's like historically, comma, when we in the charismatic movement discovered demons were real. So it's this moment of like historical discovery. This kind of bit where like a particular group, like a kind of we in the charismatic movement, like a not necessarily even all charismatics, but like a group of charismatics
Right.
made this like world historical discovery of the reality of demons. And like their response when they discover this world historical reality is to kind of rush into the fray to try and defeat them and get battered, essentially, in a lot of ways. Not necessarily lose, but like get injured, get like have bad things happen to them because they
Mm.
don't understand. I guess maybe this is a metaphor for America's history of war in general. Rush into somewhere and not actually understand where you're going and get trounced. Um,
Yeah, maybe.
um,
Maybe that's good.
think you're thinking you have vastly superior weapons of war that will totally overpower anyone you encounter.
Oh.
Um, the omnipotence of the divine in this context,
Mm.
and find that actually no, sometimes this doesn't work out.
Can I ask you a
And
question though? This quote threw me off a little bit when I first started, reading this
mm,
article because I'm thinking to myself, what do you mean that you realized demons were real? I mean, wasn't that like a given all along? I mean, isn't that what this whole evangelical, you know, warfare to begin with
mm,
the battle against Satan and his army and Satan wants to, wants your soul and you have to fight against,
yeah,
you're a soldier of God and the demons are real because they're coming and they're going to possess you. I mean, what are they talking about here?
I think this is like, I think this is something that gets into the history of modern Christianity broadly. When when kind of the Enlightenment happens in Europe and the kind of post-Enlightenment era, there's a gradual attempt within what I'd call like mainstream Christianity and mainstream Christian denominations, particularly Protestantism, to essentially like rationalize the faith in a lot of ways, to make it more palatable to modern, like post-Enlightenment audiences. So you get a like basically, I guess essentially like a trimming down of like what are seen as the more like irrational parts of Christianity, like over the course of this period, and that includes a lot of stuff that's not necessarily like directly evidenced in the Bible, because the Bible is still like the core text that you're working with, but it means that like a lot of the kind of demonological treatises from the kind of early modern period get like thrown away because it's like who are all of these named demons? Like none of these are in the like who's Malthus? Who's like what's the one in Hereditary? I always forget.
Oh,
Anyway,
I know this.
yeah,
It's it's on the tip of my tongue. I
yeah.
know.
Anyway, that
I'll think
one.
of it
Yeah, it's like
tomorrow.
who's
I'll
Malthus?
remember
Who's the
tomorrow.
one in Hereditary? Who's Stolas with his crown and his little owl legs and like all of the other
Isn't it
kind
a
of
start with an N?
I
No.
don't know. Is it Paimon?
That's what it is.
Is
Yeah,
it Paimon?
I
Yeah.
think so.
Okay.
Yeah.
But anyway, so you had all these kind of demonological treatises from the early modern period that had all of these named demons and their hierarchies and how they ruled over 72 generals in the eastern province of hell and all of that. And like none of that's in the Bible. Like so a lot of
No.
that stuff gets like thrown out as like this kind as part of this kind of rationalization of mainstream Christianity, essentially. And one of the things this leads to is the reduction of the demonic landscape almost from a kind of
Hmm.
vast plurality of demonic actors that are all doing demony things in their own little provinces and regions to like a singular figure of the devil who you're kind of struggling against. And like you see this like in the way the Bible is read, like Beelzebub, Moloch, like those figures, they're often seen as like synonyms for the devil, like not
Right.
necessarily
Right.
as like independent like entities that exist like separate from him. And this kind of continues through the day, like down to the point where I think today in a lot of mainstream Christianity, like the kind of main line of the Church of England is a good example of this, where like even the devil has kind of gone away in favor of this kind of more like nebulous concept of like evil in general, and like evil
Hmm.
is something that people do and something that is in people's hearts, but isn't like personified in the same way.
I see. Okay.
Um,
Yeah,
and I
that would
think
make
like
yeah, that makes sense because
yeah,
sorry to interrupt you there, but to
mm,
come back to what I was saying before
mm,
about growing up in that environment, that yeah, we were told that there were demons, but it was this abstract thing.
mm,
It was yeah, you could be
yeah,
possessed by a demon or you could be afflicted or how the
mm,
terminology. I can't really remember all of the terminology anymore. It's been a long
yeah.
time since I've been in that environment.
Demonized is a term they
Yeah.
use sometimes.
Right, right. Well, you can be afflicted
Yeah,
with this spirit,
mm, yeah,
but yeah, it was never. You are right. They never used names like you would have
yeah,
that whole list of thousands of names of the different
yeah.
demons. Never used names. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so I think the this framing of like the historical discovery of demons is I think reacting to that broader modern context of the kind
Okay.
of basically the kind of de-demonization of the demonologization of Christianity, where you
Okay.
get the reduction of this kind of the vast plurality of the demonic to like a singular devil to like a nebulous concept of evil that like is in the world and works through humanity. Back to this like, oh wait, there are demons not just in the sense of there being
Okay.
evil, but there are demons as in there are specific named entities with like portfolios that they're responsible for, who inhabit specific regions, who are like real like I guess, or they're not on. But we're not getting into demonic ontology right now. But anyway, they are really existent entities that
Yes.
are out there in the cosmos that have some modicum of will and action and are doing things.
Okay. I gotcha. I
Yeah.
gotcha.
So like that's the discovery. And like that ties into what Sean McLeod in his book American Possessions, which is one of the big books on spiritual warfare, came out almost a decade ago at this point, actually. That's scary.
Wow.
Actually not quite, it's like 9 years ago. I think it was like summer 2015 or something it came out.
Oh.
But like he talks in that about how spiritual warriors operate with what he calls the supernatural hermeneutics of suspicion. Do you know the phrase hermeneutics of suspicion?
Yes.
Yeah.
Very well.
So like yeah, so for the listeners, just in case, like the hermeneutics of suspicion was a phrase I think Paul Ricoeur used for regarding like Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud primarily, where they looked at society and they were like society is like the superstructure, and underneath the superstructure is like kind of what's really the kind of underlying foundations of society. And for Marx, it was economics and economic relations. For Freud, it was like the unconscious mind and like the unconscious, and for Nietzsche it was the will to power, was the kind of the base level of reality, like on which everything else kind of emerges as superstructure. And MacLeod kind of takes this notion and is like, essentially what spiritual warriors do is they evoke this supernatural hermeneutics of suspicion, where they look at society and they're like, everything that exists in the material world is essentially superstructure. And the base that it's built on is this like endless cosmic war between like good and evil, essentially, out of which like all society, all political relations, like all individual and familial relationships, like all of that arises superstructurally, like from this fundamental underlying conflict of like the supernatural war between God and gods and devils, or God and devils, essentially.
So it's demons all the way down.
Yeah, it's demons all the way. Well, there are angels there too, but no one ever talks about the
demons
angels.
and angels all the way down.
The angels never get any attention, which I think is really funny. I mean, it makes sense. Like, I mean, there were angelologies, like, historically, but, like, who was writing those, really?
Yeah, boring.
Like, yeah, but, like, it is noticeable that there's, like, a handful of books on angels by, like, these people, as opposed to, like, you know, the kind of hundreds and hundreds of books on the demonic that they've written. Which is admittedly something funny that John Paul Jackson in Needless Casualties of War actually flags up. He's like, I think we're giving too much attention to the devil people. Maybe we should not be doing this. And everyone else was like, oh, maybe he has a point, and then did it anyway.
Yeah.
Oh
boy. Okay, so all right. So my original question before I went off on the tangent with asking you the questions, is how are they plugging this in then to the politics? What are these narratives that are coming out?
So like, I guess that kind of ties into the notion of the supernatural hermeneutics of suspicion and the kind of base superstructural level, which is that essentially all politics, both globally and domestically, are outward manifestations of this underlying cosmic war between God and the devil, or God and demons broadly. Because noticeably, Satan is often fairly absent from these texts. Like, he exists, like, as an entity, like, over there somewhere, but you don't really, like, interact with him. Like, the devil does not show up and tempt you. Like, he delegates efficiently. He has lots of minions who do things for him. In fact, I think if these people said that they actually interacted with the devil, they'd probably be, like, treated with a lot of suspicion. Because I think there's this notion that Satan has better things to do than to chat to, like, you know, Carol from Missouri, for example.
Yes.
Like, gonna send like a spirit of pornography or something to do that instead. But like, or maybe Jezebel, or like a Jezebel spirit. Because sometimes there's more than one.
Sure.
And that also varies.
In Missouri, I would say Jezebel. Yeah.
I mean, Jezebel's ubiquitous everywhere. As far as I can tell, she rules America.
Yeah. Okay, we gotta be serious about this now. So
so like they see like all politics as essentially like a manifestation of an underlying spiritual conflict, and this kind of plugs directly into the way they see, like, I mean, contemporary American politics would be a good example. Like, the people that I study are inordinately in favor of Donald Trump. They were in 2016. They are in 2024. They were in 2020 as well. Like, they're very aligned with the far right of the Republican Party, and like they see the victory of often Trump specifically, or like the Republicans more generally, as a victory for kind of divine law and divine might. And like by contrast, like the Democrats are very literally demonized a lot of the time. They're like presented as either like at least like in league with demons. Like sometimes some of them go extreme and like say that they're literally possessed sometimes. Like depending on who you're talking to.
Yeah, yeah,
Thinking of like Alex Jones's like famous discussions about Obama being like literally possessed by demons and
yeah.
Hillary Clinton being possessed by demons and things. But generally speaking, like most of them don't quite go that far. They usually like talk about like the Democrats as like generally like in league with demonic forces and demonic entities. Jezebel specifically is
Mm,
commonly used. Jezebel has been associated quite heavily with Hillary Clinton, like since the 90s, to be honest. Like
yeah.
there's been this strong association in American evangelicalism between Clinton and Jezebel,
Hmm.
to the point where, and that includes like not just her presidential runs, but you know, her term as Secretary of State. Like, I'd say just like the kind of post-Clinton Democrats, like in general, have been heavily associated with Jezebel. When Trump won in 2016, for example, like there was a lot of writing from evangelicals about how like the spirit of Jezebel had finally been dethroned in the White House after basically like 20 years, like basically tying it very directly into like Bill Clinton's election in the
Uh-huh,
90s.
uh-huh.
Yeah, there's been like a lot of that. So there's this kind of very direct like politics as manifestation of cosmic war as being like a very key element, like running through a lot of the kind of over the. I mean, like always in general, but especially the last kind of 10, 20 years, which is mostly the period that I focused on.
I got something I want to ask you about. I am doing this series now about a woman who's no longer living. Her name is Sherry Shriner. Have you ever heard of this woman?
I have
American.
heard of her. I don't know a lot about her, but I do know of her.
Okay, so this is interesting
Is she
because
the one that was like that died and was mummified in her own house, or is that somebody
no,
else?
that's the
No.
Love is One
Oh yeah,
woman.
yeah, that's sorry. Yeah, I got them mixed up in
Yeah,
my head.
Sherry Shriner was a woman from Ohio who grew up in a very strict evangelical household. Went on,
Mm,
she wanted to go into like journalism and she wanted to be on TV and stuff like that. Well, she
mm,
got rejected for all that. So she started this online ministry and she appropriated so many different new age
mm.
conspiratorial concepts. And her big thing was that she claimed that she came up with all this stuff herself. So she
I mean, of
appropriated,
course.
you know how it goes. But she started this internet radio talk show called Sherry Shriner, you know, her radio
Mm,
show. She was on Blog Talk Radio. So this was back in the day,
mm.
in the early 2000s. And she died, I believe, in 2018 or 2019.
Oh, pretty recent there.
Yeah.
Like,
But she had a big portion of her message, of her ministry, was that there were aliens and there were reptilians, and that these two factions were part of this whole larger evil
mm,
narrative that had to do with this cosmic war between
mm.
Satan or the devil and God and this whole business. So she brought in a lot of Christian, evangelical Christian notions, although she left out a lot and
Yeah.
changed a lot of things around. But her narrative was that, the reason that everything was going to hell in a handbasket, literally, was that everyone in government was a clone. They were reptilian clones, and they were agents of Lucifer. So, I mean, this woman, of course, was, I
Mm,
think, quite specific in the way she presented
mm,
all of her material. I don't think that there are a lot of evangelicals out there who are, well, I don't know, but I guess that's my question. Do you find? I mean, I know you talk about
mm.
conspiracies that
Yeah.
that are intertwined with the evangelical and the
Mm,
right,
mm,
politically right leaning narratives that are out there, but in this specific case, are are the politicians being viewed as not being human, as they're being, the human has
yeah.
been
I would say that at least in the vast majority of everything that I've looked at, the politicians are distinctly human.
Okay.
They're,
Okay.
they're not literally dehumanized. They're
Okay.
maybe figuratively
Mm-hmm.
dehumanized. They are presented as in league with demons, either knowingly or unknowingly. And like I think that tends to be where the lines get drawn. Like, are these dupes or are they traders, basically, in a lot of ways?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
are they useful idiots for
Mm.
Satan? Or are they like actually like have they actually like signed blood contracts and the like and pledged themselves to the glory of Lucifer for all time? And I think like that gets into like general conspiracies, like if you like look at like the rise of QAnon like a few years ago, for
Mm-hmm.
example,
Mm-hmm.
and the kind of resurgence of the satanic panic around
Right.
like adrenochrome and and
Mm-hmm.
and child abduction and things like that. Like, for the people who were kind of in that milieu, I would say that like yeah, they either see these politicians as, if not literally, at least figuratively inhuman, like they're seen as like literally in league with demons and committing inhuman acts like for some kind of power or
Right. Right.
permanence or whatever it happens to be. So you get kind of things like that, but they don't usually go in for the whole like, oh, they're secretly reptilian
Okay.
clones, or
Right.
like they're not like literal skin suits being puppeteered by demonic entities. They are
Okay.
they
Right.
are they are rational human beings who have, for like evil reasons, pledged themselves to the Dark Lord to
Mm-hmm.
go against God's divine plan or whatever it happens to be.
Is New
Um,
World is New World Order still being thrown
New
around?
World Order is definitely still
Okay.
around.
All
Like
right.
that's always perennial.
That's there all the time. Okay.
The exact nature of the New World Order like does change periodically,
Okay.
but like it's always there because
Okay.
like the idea that the Antichrist is going to kind of create like a singular world government has just been a very prominent idea
Right.
on the right for like the last 40, 50 years, I
Yeah,
think, at
it's a
this
long
point.
time. Yeah, yeah.
And it's just part of the drinking water at this point. Like I don't think anybody even doubts it, like primarily. Like you do get occasional dissenters that will write books about like how the Antichrist empire is actually just going to be like a regional empire in the Middle East, for example. But like in generally speaking, the kind of the one world government, new world order thing is there in general.
Mm. So to get back to Trump, the last time that we spoke about, actually, this was talking about your book and about how evangelicals were supporting Trump. I was wondering if you just mentioned that the support is still there, but Trump seems to be changing his rhetoric a little bit these days. He seems to be saying some disparaging things about evangelicals, if I'm not mistaken. I thought there was not too long ago that he made some statements about the stupidity of evangelicals and things like that. And so I'm wondering, do they still see him as this agent of God and all of that stuff?
I mean, it varies.
Okay.
I think always like I think Lance Wallnau is a really good example of this. He's like the Texas preacher who was a big Trump supporter. I think he still is a big Trump supporter. He wrote a book called God's Chaos Candidate back in like 2016, 2017, around the time that Trump got elected the first
Okay.
time. He's a kind of standard right-wing evangelical preacher. Like he preaches all the kind of standard kind of anti-immigrant, like general kind of right-wing
Mm.
talking points, and kind of
Mm-hmm.
combines that with spiritual warfare and prophecy and other elements. But he was most famous for coming up with the analogy of between Trump and Cyrus from the Bible, which was very prominent
Yeah.
in the right.
Okay.
Which is like Cyrus was a pagan ruler that God used to liberate the Jews from Babylon and return them to like the promised land, essentially. And so there was a similar narrative that like there were some evangelicals that were like, no, Trump is like a true believer. He's one of us. He's like, but even those they were like often like, oh, he's like a baby Christian. He doesn't really understand. We have to guide him. But I think the more prominent narrative and like the narrative that's had the biggest staying power is this idea that God is like the Trump is like God's instrument, but like
Yeah.
that's kind of irrespective of like what Trump himself believes or
Right.
says a lot of the time.
Yeah.
He's being used by God to accomplish a specific purpose. In this context, the I guess the restoration of the chosen people to the promised land, with the promised land being America and the chosen people being
Okay.
evangelicals in this
Yeah.
context.
I was just wondering if, because I'm not living in the States
Yeah.
anymore, and you seem to be a little bit more plugged in than I am about, all of the goings on within the religious right. I just wondered that with all the stuff that's happening with all of his trials and, the convictions and,
I mean,
uh,
they just like much like the kind of stop the steal rally that I talked about. Like
mm-hmm.
most of them just convince themselves that this is all like a deep state plot to like take him out, and it's like,
Okay.
and the deep state is fundamentally demonic in a lot of these
Sure.
narratives, like either figuratively or literally. Um,
Right.
one of my favorite, quote unquote, favorite books was just a book that was just titled "The Deeper State" that I read that was just about how everything is demons all the way down, essentially.
Okay, so it is demons all the way down.
So, like, yeah, you have the deep state, and then you have the deeper state, which is just Lucifer and his mates,
Oh, wow.
basically. It's
Wow.
one of those things where, like, Trump's, like, they fundamentally believe that Trump is either innocent and being framed,
Mhm.
or, like, even if he's not innocent, being, like, unjustly persecuted. And,
Okay.
like, they'll often draw on either real or made up crimes that they believe that other politicians have done. Like, there's like you probably encountered all the conspiracies around the Clintons, for
Mm-hmm.
example, with like
Mm-hmm.
the Clinton body count and like things like that.
Yes.
So they'll often be like focused not necessarily on that specifically, but on like similar kinds of things where
Yeah.
they'll be like, even if Trump is guilty, like why are they only going after him and not after
Mm.
like all of these other like politicians that like they're not hunting down. Like clearly there is an agenda being pursued here.
Mm.
Or they'll just think that he's innocent and being framed by the deep state. So
Okay.
like yeah,
All right.
it's that thing where like evidence against the conspiracy is evidence for the conspiracy and like all of that.
Yeah, yeah. It
Yeah,
is kind of like a self-sustaining thing as well.
yeah,
So, oh boy, well, it's something else. We'll see what happens this year.
yeah. Got my hat on, watching the US election season kick off. It's been like,
It's gonna be something else. Oh, okay. Okay, so I'm looking at the time here, and we're gonna have to move on. Otherwise, we're not gonna
yeah,
get through all
yeah.
these
It's
articles.
like,
We're just chewing the fat here about Trump. We need to move on. So here we go. The next article, and this is the one that you referred to, that was from Nova Religio.
is it Religio or Religio? Like,
I
isn't
just
the actual journal title? I'm not
I
sure. Because Religio would be the actual Latin way of saying it.
Yeah, when I said that, I
Um,
thought maybe that's not the way I'm supposed to say that. I don't know. I'm going to
yeah,
say religio.
yeah.
I'm just going to
Nova
go with my
Religio.
first choice. I'm just going
Yeah,
to stick with my
yeah.
first choice. The title is These Present Darknesses, Contemporary Demonology and the Conjuration of, quote, Judeo-Christianity, end quote. You're talking about in this article a group called the New Apostolic Reformation and the groups associated with this group. Maybe we should start out before I
Hmm.
ask you any other questions about the article itself, because it kind of
Yeah.
centers around the NAR. What
Hmm.
is this group? What are they doing?
Okay, so the New Apostolic Reformation was sometimes referred to as the third wave of the Holy Spirit, was a charismatic Pentecostal movement that started in the US, primarily among former missionaries to Latin America that had come back to the United States in the mid 1980s, I would say, based in Pasadena in California that basically like pioneered the modern version of spiritual warfare, like the form of spiritual warfare that I chiefly study and that is practiced in the modern, like contemporary Pentecostal charismatic movement, derives from this group. not all practitioners of spiritual warfare are members of this group. In fact, I would say that the vast majority at the moment, like these days, are not members. But they kind of like pioneered a lot of the techniques and a lot of the ideas that you see in spiritual warfare today, and a very like prominent aspects of like yeah, just the way that spiritual warfare becomes popularized in contemporary evangelicalism in America more broadly. They're called the third wave of the Holy Spirit because they believe themselves to be the kind of third point of charismatic awakening after the first wave, which would have been the kind of the Pentecostal awakenings of the kind of late 19th and early 20th centuries, and then the kind of charismatic awakening of the kind of post-war period. They were founded by a few people, like C. Peter Wagner is probably one of the most prominent, but also like George Otis, Cindy Jacobs, Rebecca Greenwood, like various kind of other figures. They did a lot of missionary work. They worked extensively in Central and South America, being the kind of the main places. But the article's part of a special issue of Nova Religia, which is specifically on the New Apostolic Reformation more broadly. So I recommend people to check that whole issue out if they want to. It's got a lot of very good scholars in it, other than myself.
Okay.
But like the article specifically is on what I kind of think about as the kind of not like necessarily the afterlife of the NAR. They're called the NAR because they believe that the office of apostle, which is a kind of classic office within like ye olde like antique Christianity, has been revived in the modern era. So like the more mainstream forms of Christianity, like in Catholicism and like sort of mainstream Protestantism, like believe that you don't get prophets and apostles anymore. Like the offices of prophet and apostle have been kind of retired, and like God does not like appoint people those things in the modern era.
Okay.
The New Apostolic Reformation is like, actually no, prophets and apostles are appointed today. In fact, they are us and like other people that we know. But they kind of fundamentally believe that like you do get modern day apostles and modern day prophets is like kind of key part of their movement. And it's one of the reasons they're often controversial. But like what I talk about in the article is kind of I guess the long tail of NAR demonology in evangelicalism more broadly, because like most evangelical spiritual warriors that I write about, like even from the 90s onwards, like are not members of this movement. Some of them are often very, very critical of the NAR, particularly like the idea that there can be modern prophets and apostles. They're often like not a fan of those. Even evangelicals that like claim to be given prophecies these days will be like, I'm not a prophet. I simply have the gift of prophecy, which is a distinction without a difference. But anyway, although I think that I say it's a distinction without a difference, but I think there is this assumption that like a gift of prophecy means that God will occasionally just give you a prophecy, whereas being a prophet means that the things you say like are prophetic. Okay. So I think that's the distinction being made there. But anyway. So the NAR was kind of famous / infamous for a very specific form of demonology that it referred to as strategic level spiritual warfare, or more generally as kind of territorial demonology.
Right.
Which is the idea that demons possess regions of space, essentially. These can be anything from like an object or a building to an entire neighborhood to an area of a country to like an entire country to sometimes entire continents. And that sort of ties back into the kind of supernatural hermeneutic suspicion that I was talking about earlier, because they believe that fundamentally that like the kind of governing structures, the systems, the institutions, and the kind of dominant ideological paradigms in specific places are determined by whether that region is ruled by like a demonic or a divine force, essentially. So like if they go to a place and it's hostile to their form of Christianity, it has politics that they don't like, all of these things, then they'll say like, oh, there is a demon in charge here. They will attempt to figure out like who or what this demon is, often through forms of discernment. They will
Right.
do things like they'll do some reconnaissance. For example, like there's one talking about like they go to a city in Argentina, I think. I can't remember if they name where it is, like which city it is, but like there's lots of crime, things like that, and they see like murals of skeletons and stuff around. So they're like, there's a spirit of death that rules over this place, and that's the spirit that we need to pray out of the area. So they'll identify like who or what the demon is, then they'll form kind of prayer groups or do marches or sort of do various forms of ritual action to try and like exorcise whatever like demonic spirit they've identified as dominant in that region. And through doing so, they will like open up that area to kind of divine intervention. Like it will become a place of kind of divine power rather than demonic power. And a bunch of people will usually convert to Christianity, like in fairly short succession, after the demonic force has been exorcised. Because there is this notion that like demons ruling a region like makes people who live there like hostile to evangelization,
Wow, okay.
which also means that if they encounter people that are hostile to being evangelized to, they'll just say, oh, there's clearly a demon like living in this area that's making these people hostile to me, and not just that they want me to leave them alone. But so in general, there is that idea of like demons ruling regions of space. The territorial demonology was a very specific NAR thing. The other thing, which they're also known for, but is slightly broader, is the way that they concluded that basically that historically demons were real. And they did this. This is actually really interesting because it ties back into the thing I talk about in the Modern Demonology article, where like basically a lot of these people did missionary work in South America, and they found one of the things they decided there, like actually kind of in dialogue with or context of kind of various indigenous forms of spirituality that they encountered and were trying to kind of evangelize out of the people, but also kind of forms of kind of regional Catholicism and things like that. They came to the conclusion that the entities that the people they were evangelizing to were praying to actually existed. Like they weren't just empty idols, they weren't just like figments of these people's imagination. They were really existing entities that were hostile to Christianity. And a lot of what comes to be their demonology like grows out of what they see as this kind of core insight. This insight that like non-Christian spiritual beings have genuine actual existence and are fundamentally demonic, which is like hostile to evangelical Christianity in this context. And this has a lot of ramifications because for the way they write and the way that they conceptualize the world, because it means that they end up like going to places and they'll be like, oh, they'll often start looking into regional folklore or like indigenous religious traditions and things like that. I read a lot about their use of like Shinto and Buddhism in Japan, for example, where they identify certain like Shinto deities and like Buddhist figures as being like demonic entities that are ruling over the country.
Right.
They'll do similar things in other regions, like for example, some that write extensively about the Middle East, and they'll talk about like jinn, or they'll just say that Allah is a demon because obviously they don't think that God in Islam is the same God as the God in Christianity and Judaism. They think that it's some kind of demonic imposter in a lot of ways. Or they'll go even older. They'll talk about like the Canaanite, and this kind of touches on something I'll talk about in a bit with this article. They'll talk about like various kind of old Canaanite deities like Baal and Moloch and Ashtaroth and things like that.
Right.
And like entities like that. Or they'll talk about like Sumerian gods like Marduk and Enki and Ea and kind of those. They'll basically look at kind of what we might call like pagan cosmologies, thinking about the ancient world, or kind of indigenous cosmologies today, or like forms of New Age religion or just like non-Christian forms of religious practice,
Yeah, yeah.
which includes or like non-evangelical forms of Christian practice. Like they write a lot anti-Catholicism in like places, for example. They'll talk about like the Catholic saints as if they were demons, or Mary as if she was a demon, and things like that.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, but
Yeah.
like the key thing is that they're not just figments of people's imagination or kind of empty idols that people pray to. They are genuinely existing hostile, like non-physical entities that must be like actively fought in regions where they kind of hold sway. And those are kind of the two pillars they identify is as kind of having a very long kind of afterlife in evangelical demonology in America more broadly. Like this idea that like demons are like really existent things that you have to actively fight. They're not just like metaphors or like nebulous ideas of evil in human hearts, and also that they're territorial. They're
Mm,
things that
right.
are bound to regions of space and also to kind of ideological territories in a lot of ways. Like they're not just say like in Washington D.C. They are like bound to like the Democratic Party as an institution or like
Okay, right.
modern
Okay.
feminism or
Yeah,
like
yeah.
things like that will be like identified as like material like geographic, geopolitical, and ideological territories of demonic power that need to be like actively fought and kind of conquered, essentially.
Right. So, and you mentioned that this, from what it sounds like, this group has been very influential in like spreading the ideas around to different evangelical
Yeah.
groups. Even though you mentioned that there are evangelicals not affiliated with NAR, but they use a lot of the same
Hmm.
claims. And there was this one. Actually, you wrote about it in a few of the articles. You talked about this Skywatch TV ministry.
I love Skywatch
And
TV.
I I tell you what, something else. I mean, I'm from Missouri, and this is
Yeah.
where this ministry is. And I don't know. I guess we're going to get back into the conspiracies again because this has kind of like this angle to it, right? The
Yeah.
conspiracy theory angle. Could you talk a little bit more about what this? Because I did not know about this Skywatch TV.
I encountered them during my PhD in a very roundabout way.
Okay.
My supervisor sent me a link to a book by Thomas Horn, just randomly.
Uh huh.
It was a book that he'd written on. It was basically an anti-Catholic book about like the Pope being like some kind of. I don't think it was the Antichrist specifically, but some kind of like demonic entity coming in the future. But like, and I only read a bit of that book at the time, but the book that I really read by him, which was one on transhumanism,
Oh.
which was called Forbidden Gates, and it was about like emerging technology and transhumanism as like what he called the dawn of techno-dimensional spiritual warfare,
All
which
right.
I just love as a
Oh,
phrase.
got some new things going on here. Okay.
So Skywatch TV is a media ministry that's based out of Missouri. It's effectively like a family, originally like essentially a kind of a family business, originally,
Right.
or a family ministry. It was founded by a man called Thomas Horn, who was a former member of the Assemblies of God, which is a big kind of Pentecostal
Oh, yeah.
movement. He started in the Assemblies of God. He did eventually leave the Assemblies of God. I don't know if he ever formally left them or if he just like ended up like effectively leaving them. But he founded an organization which I don't think was called Skywatch TV originally. I'm trying to remember the name. It was originally called something else. And he kind of worked with his wife, with his two children, with his children's spouses, with like a couple of friends that he has that are like unrelated. Like the main of which that I talk about in this article is Derek Gilbert, who's like the anchor for their kind of news program, essentially, and like is, to be honest, a bit of a nerd. Like he loves writing. His books are really interesting because they actually reference a ton of genuine academic works, like actual academic works, and
Oh,
then
okay.
spin the discoveries in them in light of spiritual warfare. Like he'll like the classic one is he'll draw on research that's really extensive about like connections between like various like old like ancient Near Eastern tribes and like the relationships between them. Then he'll be like, ah, but these scholars are missing the crucial fact, which is that demons are real, essentially.
Okay. I get you.
And then he'll use the actual historical research, like by reputable scholars, as a grounding platform to kind of build the legitimacy of his of
Uh-huh.
his spiritual
Oh.
warfare narratives. But Skywatch TV is, I would say they're on the fringes of even kind of modern evangelical stuff, but they have a lot of connections to like more like mainstream like or more like reputable evangelical organizations. Like they often have guests on the show that are like more prominent authors. Like they're basically like they're part of the general network of modern
Okay.
evangelical writing. And they cater to a very specific audience that's very like prominent in an undercurrent way, which is
Mm-hmm.
the intersection between spiritual warfare, evangelical politics more broadly, and conspiracy theories. And not just conspiracy theories in the sense of like there being a new world order or things like that, because they do write about that. That's definitely
Mm-hmm.
part of it. But they'll go into a lot more. They'll write about like UFOs and aliens and cryptozoology and like all of these other kind of areas and build like these like new age religion
Yeah.
and the occult, and
Right.
they write about like the history of like Aleister Crowley and like Jack Parsons and things like that, and like build these things into the historical narrative, which does include at one point, I don't know if I've ever had time to put this in an actual article, so you're going to get it here,
Ooh.
the claim that Hillary Clinton is a product of the Babylon ritual done by Jack Parsons and L. Ron Hubbard in the desert. Like,
Okay.
like
So she is the
she is literally Babylon of Thelema
Babylon.
incarnate.
She is the
Like,
Babylon. Okay,
apparently.
right. Wow. Well, it fits.
Yeah.
Everything that they say about her, it fits.
Also, the Large Hadron Collider in
Yeah.
Europe is going to open the portal to the abyss in Revelation.
Well, here we come back around to Sherry Shriner because she talks about the same, well, not the exact same, but she
Yeah.
talks about the Large Hadron Collider opening a portal so that the aliens will come in, the faction of aliens that are working with
Yeah.
Satan, and that's going to bring around the end of the world because they're going to come in
Yeah.
and destroy
See, the
destroy
interesting thing with
humans.
that is Skywatch TV actually has very similar takes to that.
I
Yeah,
think Sherry Shriner's followers would listen to this
they
stuff.
probably would. So, like, the thing that Skywatch TV does not actually believe in aliens. I think that's kind of like a crucial point. They
Okay.
believe that aliens are real, but they are demons pretending to
Yes.
be aliens. So, like, there's this big thing, like a whole bunch of the last bunch of books that they kind of put out. Thomas Horn has like passed away now. Sadly, he passed away
Oh, okay.
last year, like some late mid to late last year. But they're still publishing books based on his notes that are being finished by his children. And
Okay.
all of his recent books have been about like the idea that there is coming like alien disclosure coming in the future,
Mm-hmm.
but that it will be like a ruse by Satan, essentially.
Oh.
So like basically that the humans that are in league with demons are going to introduce the demons to humanity as if it's alien contact. Is like
Right.
the big conspiracy they've been on for like at least that Thomas Horn specifically was on the last few years, and that's kind of been that's their thing at the moment.
Okay. I'm gonna have to check these people out.
Yeah, I will warn you, Thomas Horn's books are terribly written. The one thing I will say for Derek Gilbert is that his books are insane, but they are also actually quite readable,
All right.
which is actually slightly concerning because it means I can imagine people reading them and being convinced by them.
Hmm.
I cannot
Well,
imagine anyone reading Thomas Horn's books and being convinced by them, unless you were already convinced by
yeah,
them.
yeah,
But Gilbert, I'm like, no, I could see someone reading this and go, particularly because of the way he uses like legitimate academic sources,
yeah,
like
yeah.
builds narratives quite effectively. But anyway, so Skywatch TV basically just deals a lot with that kind of intersection of
Right. Okay.
conspiracies and spiritual warfare, and like they do a lot of conspiracy stuff and a lot of kind of fairly outre out there conspiracy stuff as well.
Mm, mm.
But there'll be stuff about like the Washington Monument. There's like I think there's a book that claims that like the Antichrist is going to reincarnate into the body of Nimrod that's like buried under Washington D.C. and stuff like that in one of the books.
Oh, I love it. I love it.
Yeah, no, I mean, honestly, I read them in part because one, they are kind of part of the general network, but also when I've just been reading stuff that's just almost like relentless, just hate speech mixed with various bits of demonology. It's Skywatch TV's books are kind of fun, even if they're also as hateful and strange.
Mm.
Like, there's elements of them that I'm like, no, I can't actually take this too seriously.
So they're
Like,
kooky. They're
they're,
they're
they're
kooky.
kooky, they're kooky and entertaining in like a
Okay.
strange way.
Oh, Lordy.
At least they pass for entertaining in my world, which is
Right.
a very strange world.
Yeah, mine
But
too.
yeah.
If you'd like to hear the whole interview, please visit my Patreon page and consider becoming a member. Or, alternatively, you can purchase this episode for a small fee. Please check out the program notes for the articles and all the links. If you'd like to read the articles that aren't open access, just send Jonathon an email and they'll be happy to send you a PDF. A little reminder, I will be taking a little break in November as I'm moving house and getting my home studio all set up and ready to go, but I'll be back in December with new content. Take care, and as always, thanks for listening.